Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Oh, I think we could do better. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's great to be with you. As the signs proclaim outside, this is my 40th year here at Anshe. It's been a long, wonderful period. And I remember my very first introduction to the high holiday period. There I was, fresh out of the seminary with my new white robe. It was Slichot, the introductory service for the high holidays. My job was to recite a prayer, one of the opening prayers with the congregation. So I got up from my seat. I walked and tried to look as confident as I possibly could, though I was pretty terrified. And I invited the congregation to rise as I had learned. I made my hands raise up, and everyone dutifully stood up. I was feeling pretty good. And then I heard the voice of my senior rabbi behind me say, "Now tell them to sit down." You see, it wasn't really a standing prayer. So I dutifully had them seated. And everyone laughed. Everyone smiled. And I suddenly realized that the sky didn't fall when I made a mistake. The world didn't come to an end. I learned that rabbis could make mistakes in services, and people could smile. And as people in this community know, I have been making mistakes ever since. Reality orientation is a term that we use when we would want to describe a moment when we become aware that our actual reality is different than the one that we perceived. Sometimes reality orientation is like my example, a moment of elation when we find out that the worst case scenario that we have been dreading has actually not come to pass, or our diagnosis is not the one that we were dreading. It's also possible that reality orientation can be just the opposite. An opportunity to discover that one situation is actually worse than the one that you perceived. Abraham, in our Torah reading this morning, offers a great example of the negative side of reality orientation as this week's portion opens. You recall, as last week's portion concluded, Abraham had successfully fulfilled the great test of the binding of Isaac. He had taken his son to the mountaintop. He had shown his great faith. He received the blessings of God and the promise for his progeny. He was secure that the covenant would continue to the next generation, that all of God's promises would be fulfilled in the future. Abraham must have breathed a great sigh of relief when he came down that mountain. The worst was over. The patriarchal blessing of, wow, is this really happening? Our portion this week, Chayei, Sarah, literally just a few verses later opens with something shocking: the death of Sarah. It's presented without any warning. And Abraham must deal with his own mourning for the woman who walked with him into the wilderness, the woman who stood by him in the most challenging of moments, and the woman who had borne Isaac at the age of 90. As if that wasn't difficult enough, Abraham was without a burial site. He He had to negotiate with the people of the land, the B'nai Chet, for a suitable place to bury his wife. This man, who had just been blessed by the Creator of the heavens and the earth, this man who was promised that the very land that he was standing on was his Yerusha, it was his inheritance, that it was his children's land for all time, was forced to acknowledge in this painful moment that he was a ger toshav, that he was a resident alien. And resident aliens in his time were rarely ever allowed to own land. In other words, Abraham had to approach the B'nai Chet and ask them if they would bend their own rules, if they might sell Abraham a parcel of land so that his wife could be buried. I imagine that it would be hard to fathom how Abraham was feeling in that moment, that reality orientation of seeing the world flipped on its head. Abraham ultimately purchased the cave of Machpelah in Hebron for an exorbitant sum. In the end, Sarah, Abraham's beloved wife, was buried there, as are the patriarchs and most of the matriarchs. And yet, the difficulty of that moment continues to resonate throughout Jewish history. Our tradition teaches that Maseh Avot Siman Levanim, that the actions of our patriarchs and our matriarchs will be experienced by their descendants. The story of Abraham identifying himself as a ger toshav is a wonderful example. How many times have the descendants of Abraham and Sarah had their realities reoriented when they learned that the societies that they thought they were citizens of, lands on which they thought they had a secure place, became the polar opposite? Like Abraham, they were resident aliens after all. The rights that they thought they had were no more. And the sad reality is that Jews throughout history knew exactly what it felt like to be at the mercy of other people, just like Abraham, when your fate is no longer in your hands. Janet and I were just in Greece, along with Cantor Mizrahi and Debbie. We had the opportunity to lead a congregational trip to the place that Hellenism was born. We went to Greece. And one of the things that I learned along the way was that throughout Jewish history, Greece was a place that Jews fled when they could no longer live in the country of their origin. Jews found their way to Greece not long after the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, and they were amongst the very first of Greece's Jewish residents. Jews fled from the destruction of the second temple and the reach of the Romans, and they came to Greece as well. Western Europeans fled from Christian persecution. Spanish Jews fled to Salonika from the Inquisition, and all of these Jews had something in common with Abraham besides the monotheistic faith. They had all believed that their country of origin was their land. They all believed that they were citizens, only to learn that the larger society that they lived in saw them as other, saw them as Jews. And they, like Abraham, learned the meaning of the term ger toshav, what it means to be a resident alien. That reality orientation that we spoke of earlier. While in Greece, I read a piece in the Washington Post written by Dana Milbank, an opinion writer. Here's how his piece began. On the holiest night of the Jewish year earlier this month, my rabbi looked up from his Kol Nidre sermon, a homily about protecting America's liberal democracy, and he posed a question to the congregation that was not in his text. Quote, "How many people in the last few years have been at a dining room conversation where the conversation has turned to where we might move if things get worse in this country?" How many of us? He was talking about the unthinkable, that Jews might need to flee the United States. And as Dana Milbank continues, he notes, looking around the congregation, I saw that many, if not most, of the hands went up. The name of the piece is American Jews Start Thinking the Unthinkable. On the bus traveling through Greece, I asked my fellow travelers the same question, and a meaningful percentage of the hands on the bus went up, including my own, including Janet's, because we too have had that conversation. I must admit that for the first time in my life, I am feeling the power of those words, ger toshav, a resident alien. It's not as though I have been unaware that the cancer of anti-Semitism exists in this country. After all, anti-Semitic acts are taking place across the United States of America, and the internet is rife with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It is the normalization of anti-Semitism that is new. It is the acceptance in American culture, in our schools, on our campuses, in our daily discourse, the words of celebrity icons or the threats of ex-presidents that is so chilling. And most painfully, our children are experiencing Abraham's dilemma of discovering that you are a ger toshav as well. On the campus of Northwestern University, a junior wrote an op-ed piece in the school newspaper recently, of which she is one of the editors. Lily Cohen wrote of her love of Judaism. She spoke of her Shabbat experience on campus in the most glowing terms. She also wrote about her love of Israel while acknowledging her concern for the rights of Palestinians. In the article, Lily Cohen voiced her concern for signs across the Northwestern campus that read, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." She noted that the phrase originated more than 30 years ago, evolving from the language in the 1988 Hamas charter that promoted the destruction of the land of Israel. And she wrote this: "When that slogan is plastered around the walls of buildings where I study, when it's hung across the arch that I walk under every day, when it's painted over the rock that I helped paint only 5 hours earlier in support of voting for gun safety and reproductive rights, I take offense. I feel hurt. I get angry." What Lily was asking for in this article was understanding. What Lily was asking for was dialogue on her campus. What she was met by were posters made from the copies of her articles, pasted on a poster board, and then in large print over her words were the words, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And those posters made their way across the Northwestern campus. Now, to be honest with you, I'm not surprised about the posters around the campus. Campuses across the country are rife with anti-Israel sentiment, where political discussions quickly devolve into anti-Semitic tropes. It's not all that shocking that Lily's appeal was turned on its head. What is surprising is the school's response. The first came from Robin R. Means Coleman, Vice President and Associate Provost for Diversity and Inclusion. She wrote, "Northwestern encourages and protects freedom of expression, a foundational principle of our democracy. The fact that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is being vigorously debated on our campus is a testament to that commitment. As we engage in dialogue, we ask that all students, faculty, and staff practice those freedoms responsibly and with a concern for other members of our community and adherence to campus policies and community standards." Nothing about the sign, nothing about the feelings of a student that had appealed for dialogue, nothing about the hatreds being expressed in the face of a person open to engagement. Instead, the person whose job it is to protect diversity on that campus, to ensure that all feel safe at Northwestern, calls for both sides to behave themselves. Yesterday, the university president wrote a stronger statement. In this latest incident, one student sought to express how she felt as a Jewish person upon viewing the sign "From the river to the sea." I would have hoped that the people who put up the sign near Deering Meadow, painted on top of pasted together copies of her well-reasoned op-ed, would have responded instead by discussing the issues perhaps through their own op-ed. He continues, "As we deal with some of the knottiest issues on campus, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is among the most difficult, I hope that we can remember that persuasion through reason is always more appropriate than intimidation. And at the end of the day, we are a community dedicated to knowledge, not slogans. I want you to note that the words unacceptable or the word consequences for hateful behavior never appear in the president's words. His message is, let's be more reasonable in our conversations. Now, what's taking place at Northwestern has a chilling similarity to what took place at Jones College Prep, not very far from here, when a student came dressed in an East German military uniform on Halloween and goose-stepped across the stage in a costume contest. And when the shocked students looked at the principal for a statement, this is what they received. I certainly understand and regret the discomfort and harm felt by some members of our school community. Please be assured that we take the well-being of all students seriously and do not tolerate hateful expressions of any kind. In this situation, it certainly appears that this was not the intent of the Halloween costume." Really? In the same way that there is a difference between dialogue and hanging slogans that advocate the destruction of the Jewish state, one cannot mistake the intent of a student in a German uniform goose-stepping across the stage. Here again, it was Jewish students who stood up and raised their voices. The heads of the Jewish club on the Jones campus, Gabi Josephson and Riley Amblin, both students who are part of this Anshe Emet community, guided their classmates to a strong resolution of the problem. They joined with the black students group and staged a sit-in. They went to the news media and served as remarkable spokespeople for the Jewish community. They rejected the normalization of anti-Semitism before their eyes. Gabby and Riley are working to institute meaningful Holocaust education, which is sorely missing in that school and many others, and are working hard to create a dialogue, hard conversations on their campus. How sad is it that the students had to be the ones to remind the administration that goose-stepping across the stage is an overt act of anti-Semitism, that it is not a joke. On Kristallnacht, we at Anshe had heard from Amy Spitalnik, who headed an organization called Integrity First for America. Under her leadership, this organization led the efforts against those who organized the neo-Nazi march in Charlottesville. One of the points that she made about the trial was how well the defendants were before they went on trial. They all said they were joking in their words, that their slogans and posts weren't meant to be taken seriously, that they didn't intend anti-Semitic remarks to be taken so seriously. Amy reminded us that the humor that they portray is one of the best ways to normalize anti-Semitism in this country. For those who watched Dave Chappelle's monologue on Saturday Night Live, you had the opportunity to watch a master class on the normalization of anti-Semitism through humor. It began with a mockery of an apology for anti-Semitism in what sounded thoughtful, made a joke of Jewish claims of anti-Semitism in this country, while the audience laughed and applauded. The best critique of Dave Chappelle's words came from a black Orthodox rabbi who calls himself Manish Tana. He wrote this: "There are lots of jokes made in Hollywood at the expense of Jews. This, however, was not a case of Jews being unable to laugh at themselves. There's a difference between laughing at ourselves and having someone who isn't Jewish use a wink-wink anti-Semitic trope. It's not that Chappelle's monologue wasn't funny on its face, it's that it was harmful. This isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening in a specific context, particularly one in which anti-Semitism has already been riled up and emboldened by Kanye and Irving. Hebrews to Negroes has become a bestseller on Amazon after Irving tweeted about it. In other words, Chappelle's jokes normalize anti-Semitism. They stoke the fire that says Jews bring their hatred upon themselves and are deserving of whatever happens to them. With this kind of thinking being shared with millions of viewers on SNL, is it a surprise that anti-Semitic incidents are at an all-time high in this country, where distinguishable Jewish religious Jews are being beaten on the street in this country? In Rogers Park? Is it a surprise that Jews are talking about where they might move? We are facing a reality orientation test in our time, and we best take it seriously. While Abraham was a ger toshav, we are not. We are not resident aliens in this country. We are citizens. And we are blessed to live in the greatest democracy that the world has ever conceived. A country where we have rights. And we must take this moment seriously and do as young people like Lily Cohen, Gabby Josephson, Riley Ablin are doing. They are raising their voices and saying, this is not acceptable. This is not okay. They are calling out anti-Semitism, and they refuse to allow it to become normalized. To say that something is not funny, or that it is unacceptable, or demand that those in authority, whether it be a school principal, a university president, an elected official, or a clergy person, be held accountable, is what all of us must be doing. Dan Goldwyn is here this morning, and I want to thank Dan for the work that he's doing as Executive Director of Public Affairs for the Jewish Community Relations Council and Government Affairs Department, because it's vital, and he needs our support. Just as our friends do at the ADL, it is vital that we raise our voices and speak out, but these young leaders and these organizations are doing something more. They're not shutting down dialogue. They're working to keep it open. That's what I'm doing with Black clergy. I am encouraging thoughtful, hard conversations. And that makes a difference. This is a moment that calls on all of us to take action where we can. Whether it be a conversation at our Thanksgiving table, with a colleague at work, or in the elevator. They may be uncomfortable conversations, but they are vital if we're going to ensure that our reality in this country not be changed. This is a moment that calls upon us to embrace the promise of what it means to be a citizen in the United States, and not that of a ger toshav, not that of a resident alien. Shabbat shalom.